Awesome. Great. Well, I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, Dr. Christina Eisenberg. She is the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence in the Indigenous Natural Resources Office at Oregon State University. She's a community ecologist focusing on synergistic solutions to challenging natural resource problems by braiding together and catalyzing the empirical strengths and logic of scientific knowledge and the insights and wisdom of traditional ecological knowledge to gain binocular vision, called two-eyed seeing. She is very interested in creating, facilitating, and supporting intercultural collaborative partnerships between Indigenous peoples, universities such as Oregon State University, federal agencies, and conservation nonprofits. So with that, Christina, I will hand the microphone off to you.
Thank you for that, Dakota. And that was a wonderful introduction, ice-breaking exercise. And it was interesting to see the common ground and common concerns. And I am a woodland owner, and I manage it. My husband is not a forester, and I got a degree in forestry in part because of things that I saw that were not being done right, and really wanting to understand better what I could do better. So and my woodland is I have two woodlands, and they're in northwest Montana, and I'll be sharing some stories about them a little later. This image is of my master's student, Ashley Russell. It's a really interesting picture, and I'm Native, so I like to share stories. That's the way I communicate. So the story behind this is Ashley Russell. She's the Director of Culture and Natural Resources for the Confederated Tribes of the Kusla, Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians. They were one of the Oregon's tribes that had all of their lands taken by colonizers in the federal government. And they just got some land back. Their reservation is actually about 3 acres in size. But they worked for over 100 years to get back some of their ancestral lands. And they were, in 2018, they were given back 20,000 acres of their ancestral lands. This is near the Oregon coast. And these were lands that were formerly, when they were taken from the tribes, these were BLM, Oregon and California Railroad lands. Those lands were clear cut, and the proceeds from that were used to do things such as fund Oregon State University, which is a land grant institution where I work now. It's really an interesting history. It used to be a cedar forest. It was replanted with Doug firs, a plantation. And that is an old cedar that my student is looking at. And she's one of the top ethnobotanists in Oregon, and very traditional Native woman who also is passionate about Western science. And so her task is, how do we restore these woodlands? Because that forest is in terrible condition because of climate change, and the species were planted there were not the ones that were historically there. And not traditional processes of stewarding those lands, which included cultural burning, were removed. And then what happened is that many of those lands became protected reserves as part of the Northwest Forest Plan. And so I'm going to be talking about that and other policy impacts and how they affected not just federal lands, but privately owned forest lands, such as what this tribe got, or what happens if one has a woodland that's embedded in all of this. Next slide, please. My journey. So I was a stay-at-home mom. I didn't go back to college until after my daughters urged me to go back to college when they were 13 and 14. So I did, and I got a master's degree and a PhD in forestry and wildlife at Oregon State University. these pictures are about my life journey. The picture on the top is me with Aldo Leopold's daughter Nina walking at the shack. It's a privately owned woodland at the time. This was almost 2 decades ago. She mentored me, and she was in the process of leading the restoration of that forest, which had been strictly protected. Although Leopold had been treating it with fire, with cultural burning. Although Leopold's daughter was, his wife was Native American. And so he brought, her perspectives combined with his as a Western trained scientist to restoring the land around the shack. And so here we are going for a walk and exchanging stories. Next image is of me. My PhD was on cultural keystones, which include fire and wolves and bison, and what happened when they were removed from forests and grasslands throughout North America, the impacts of that. Because on my woodland, I saw wolves return, and I saw some huge changes when that happened. And I may talk a little bit more about that. That's me doing a wolf den survey over 20 years ago, and I realized I like doing ecology work. It's like this voyage of discovery. The image in the center is after I got my PhD. I did a bunch of work in Scotland, in the most remote part of the Scottish Highlands, where they had this private landowner had planted 1 million trees without any real plan. And this is an area that is close to the Arctic Circle. So trees grow really, really slowly there. And I got a grant to study whether his reforestation efforts had worked. The forest had been clear cut by the Romans. And before that, Indigenous people managed those forests using a variety of tools there, including fire. So that caused the soils to shift considerably. And you can see that I'm in my happy place. So forestry for me, and looking at the impacts of human relationships with forests and how they've changed over time and how that affects forests, those are things I'm passionate about. Image on the bottom was taken last year. I'm in the field on one of the Oregon State University College of Forestry forests. The College of Forestry is a top-ranked school of forestry in the Western Hemisphere. I never imagined me, a stay-at-home mom, would end up as an associate dean at a school like this. And my job in the College of Forestry is to take us into the future by considering bold new ideas that have to do with social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that includes supporting equity for women and incorporating Indigenous knowledge in how we manage forests. And that is the sticker, that's the emblem of our office. And that is a braid of sweetgrass, which I'll talk about later. And that's camas, which is a culturally significant species that grew in the understory of the forest in Oregon, is now mostly missing. And it was dependent on fire, and it was a primary food source for the Native people throughout the West. Next slide. So today I'm going to talk about the problem, what the condition of forests in North America is, what the US is doing to address the crisis forests are facing, the role of Indigenous knowledge, federal policies regarding Indigenous knowledge and Western science, and what can private forest owners do, and the role of women woodland owners in forest conservation. Next slide. Okay, here's the problem. This is in Oregon. In 2020, we had the Labor Day fires. It got very windy. Some power lines went down throughout Oregon, sparking, setting off sparks. It was a drought year, an extreme drought year. And as a result, there were 5 mega fires that blew up on Labor Day. Over a span of 2 or 3 days, they blew up into these enormous high severity fires. And I've studied fire a whole lot, and this is not anything that happened historically. This is way outside the pattern of how these forests are fire dependent, but nothing like this. There were at least 7 fires. I think 5 of them were mega fires. The same thing happened in other parts of North America. And these fires also burned up privately owned woodlands, tribal forest lands. And so that's the problem. Next slide. But it's worse. So this, there's something called heat stress, and that happens when the temperature, there's been a drought, and then the temperature goes way above what is typical for the region. This is a forest that is on BLM land in a lake successional reserve. And you can see this all over in many, many places, including in the Northeast. These forests are dying. They're too dense. They're way more dense than they used to be historically. And so when something like severe climate change impacts hit, they're trees that are on life support. They're mostly Douglas firs. They were planted after a clear cut, maybe in 1950-ish. And then because of the Northwest Forest Plan, they became labeled a no-touch reserve, which means nobody could go in there and do any type of thinning or do anything that would have increased the resilience of these forests. And the soil can't sustain, doesn't provide enough moisture for those trees because the soil has not burned. There hasn't been any cultural burning, and the cultural burning greatly increased the soil's capacity to hold moisture for the long term. And so everything is shifted, and we're seeing this, and these trees are all dying. And even if there were like a tiny lightning strike, it would set off a massive fire, high severity fire here. This is one of my study sites in Oregon, by the way, that I'm working in with tribal nations and the Bureau of Land Management. Next slide. And then there's this. This is Shenandoah National Park. And there's a combination of diseases and invasive insect infestation that came from horticultural species that were brought over from Asia, affecting the eastern part of the US profoundly. I did a residency at Harvard Forest this year, and oh my God, what's happening to the hemlock trees in that forest is 90% of them are dead or dying. And this is widespread, and climate change exacerbates this tremendously, along with shifts in how those forests were managed from how they were historically by Indigenous people. Next slide. So in 2022, the federal government asked me, the Forest Service and Susan Pritchard, to create a report for the White House, with President Biden, about how can we fix that? And they wanted it led by an Indigenous author, me, to provide Indigenous perspectives on how we can restore resilience to our nation's forests, and not just federal forests, but all forest lands, right? And how we can bring together Western science and Indigenous knowledge to create climate adapted forests, so forests that are resilient to what's happening with the climate. And there's a link to this report. It's publicly accessible. We will be writing, we've been invited to write some journal articles based on this report, including one for the journal Nature. And there's 40 co-authors. So Susan and I convened this amazing group of people, very diverse folks from all over the United States. We take an eco-regional approach, so there's a southeast, there's a northeast, there's a southwest, there's a Pacific Northwest, there's the upper Great Lakes states. Each of them have unique geographies and issues and unique cultures when it comes to Indigenous peoples. A third of the authors are Indigenous, a third work for the Forest Service, and a third are professors at universities. And this report was funded by the Forest Service and by charitable, some of the larger foundations in the US also helped fund this report. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into all of the federal policy because there's a lot, but it was in 2022, President Biden, advised by Secretary Haaland, realized we have a very serious problem here, and the kind of conventional way of thinking about how we steward forests, how we restore them, isn't working. Western science is failing us. So we really need to look to multiple types of knowledge. Since then, there have been several executive orders, and this is legislation that just came through on May 6th that calls for Indigenous knowledge to be incorporated at the earliest stages when creating a forest management plan. And that and it defines Indigenous knowledge. So I'm going to get into that and how it can work. That picture is from the Grand Ronde tribes in Oregon, where they restored an oak savanna. So if this isn't halfway through that restoration project, a huge problem they face are invasive species in the understory. Next slide. Okay, so this is a definition of Indigenous knowledge that was created by the Office of Tribal Relations in the Forest Service, and it is really beautiful and comprehensive. It's a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, practices, and beliefs developed by tribes and Indigenous people through interaction and experience with the environment. It's applied to phenomena across biological, physical, social, cultural, and spiritual systems. So it's spiritual. Indigenous knowledge can be developed over millennia, continues to develop, and includes understanding based on evidence acquired through direct contact with the environment and long-term experiences, as well as extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. That image, I have a print of that painting hanging in my office in the College of Forestry. That's called Wisdom of the Universe by Christy Belcourt, and it's a forest and all the life within that forest. And the longer you look at it, the more you see in there. There's pollinators, there's lichens, there's mosses, there's seeds. And the idea is that everything is connected in a forest. Next slide. An element that's key to stewarding a forest with Indigenous knowledge is a seventh generation principle, which is that decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 human generations into the future. And a human generation is about 20 years. It's 140 years. So just imagine if everyone made decisions that way, rather than on the immediate effects and short-term gains. Another way to look at Indigenous knowledge is it's when you look at a forest and use Indigenous knowledge to steward it, it's a lot like how you take care of your family. So this is a relationship that's based on reciprocity. You take what you need, you give back more than you take. And it's a long-term relationship. So the braid of sweetgrass is used by Robin Wall Kimmer to represent these relationships. And there's 3 strands in a braid. And in her metaphor, she uses those 3 strands like this. And Robin is a friend of mine, and she loves that we titled our report, creating sweetgrass, and dedicated it to her. And she's going to be teaching out of it this fall, at the university in New York, where she is based out of. So the three strands are: one strand is Indigenous knowledge, another strand is Western science, the third strand is what brings us together. And what brings us together is our deep concern about these forests and what's happening to them. All forests, regardless of ownership, are in deep trouble right now. And it's unprecedented. We've never experienced anything quite like that historically. Next slide. So here's a quick look at what happened. That's Harvard Forest. That is based on dendrochronology. That is a reconstruction of what that forest once looked like. Indigenous people used to burn it. They used to cut trees in that forest. Now the Harvard Forest, much of it is managed as a preserve. No touch, right? A protected forest. Some of it is managed in different ways with different treatments, but we just did an internship there for a report that we wrote. We were funded to do that by those foundations, and the thought is that if we just protect everything, things will go better, right? And it isn't quite working. In that forest, 90% of the hemlocks are dying. So anyway, what happened is that traditional Indigenous stewardship of these forests, and there were lots and lots, there were millions of Indigenous people here who cut trees and used them for sustenance and survival. That was replaced by Euro-American settlement in Europe. What I learned in Scotland, that I heard about this before, is that the reason that people came to what is today North America from Europe is that they were out of wood, they were out of timber. They had clear cut everything and managed things so poorly that the forests were not regenerating fast enough to give them what they needed. So they came to North America and saw this vast expanse of woodlands and proceeded to do the same thing. So that's a very famous painting. That's American Progress. That is the Oregon Trail. They arrived in Oregon in 1830 and proceeded to take the land from tribal nations and clear cut it. And this is a plantation in the Pacific Northwest. This is images courtesy of American Forests, and I work closely with American Forests to advise them on Indigenous knowledge. Next slide. So cutting all the trees like that for profit with impunity is a top-down approach, right? Humans can control nature, and we're just going to take what we need. American Forest was founded in 1875 out of deep concern for what was happening. The same thing that happened in Europe that caused civilizations like the Roman Empire to collapse were happening in North America. The same things. So American Forest was founded, and the first thing they did was recommend the creation of the Forest Service so that there would be some form of regulations for how forests were being managed and harvested. And Gifford Pinchot, who was one of the people who created the sustained yield concept, in his autobiography, he wrote, "There are just two things on this material earth, people and natural resources." So shortly after becoming the director of the Forest Service, he created protected reserves, a lot of protected reserves. And this was before they were formally known as wildernesses, right? But he was very focused on conservation and sustained use, sustainable yield of those forests. But it was still a top-down, man over nature approach, as this quote indicates. So humans are separate from the natural world and we can control it. Next slide. we're talking about two worldviews. So remember the strand of sweetgrass, the braid of sweetgrass. There's the egocentric, which is what I just described. Okay, we created a problem. So now we're going to fix it, and we're going to fix it by controlling everything, right? Versus the indigenous, and these are philosophies or worldviews. They have to do with values that are deeply embedded. The ecocentric is that humans are at the center of nature. We're embedded in the natural world. And not only that, we can't control nature, and we're not even close to being the smartest creature. In fact, in Native American mythology, there's many example after example of how we're the dumbest creature in the natural world. And that maybe if we pay attention with humility, forests, grasslands, the animals in the natural world can teach us what we need to do to not just survive, but to live well on the planet. Next slide. And a Canadian elder created the term two-eyed seeing for this. So I'm not going to go into all the components of this, but we come together with shared priorities, which are shared concerns about the natural world. We co-create a plan to steward the natural world and how we're going to do it, the methods, what type of treatments are we going to apply to forests? What type of thinning? And then we implement this, and then we come together to co-evaluate and for the community to validate, did this work or not? This applies for any land. So the federal government wants to apply this to national forests, and that's what the National Old Growth Amendment is about. But it leads to long-term relationships between all the people involved and long-term benefits for the natural world for forests. So next slide. So how about the forests of the future? This is one of the fires in the Pacific Northwest. But these fires are burning everywhere. That's what our report found, that they're all over the US. It's that forest stewardship that allows for a broader array of ecological functions. These are characteristics. We need to steward forests towards this. But forests that are more resilient to wildfire and other disturbances, such as insect outbreaks and pathogens. Forests that are better adapted to deal with climate change. And such stewardship requires two-eyed seeing. To Western science, it's not alone. It's a powerful, powerful tool, but alone it's not going to get us where we need to go. Next slide. I'm on the board of the Society for Ecological Restoration. I'm a director at large. My role there is to guide the society, which is international and global, on Indigenous knowledge. And I was one of the co-authors of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. I wrote the second principle. So in order to restore resilience to woodlands, to grasslands, to marine environments, we need to use all types of knowledge. And knowledge that comes from practitioner experience, such as very place-based landowner experience, local and what used to be called traditional ecological knowledge. The tribes in the United States decided that they prefer the term indigenous knowledge to TEK, but both mean the same thing. Next slide. And also there's this policy document that was written by the the Office of Tribal Relations for the Forest Service. And this concept, Mitakuye Oyasin, it's ancient. It's a Lakota concept. It means that we are all related. It acknowledges that everything is related, from people to plants and animals. And it has a deeper meaning that everything in our universe is interconnected. So think about the Pinchovian model, about humans are separate and we make decisions. We're the rulers of the universe. And this is a totally different way of looking at any natural system. Next slide. There are in Native cultures, it's a very common story, and I'm not allowed to share this in detail because this is not my culture. I'm Baramuri and Western Apache, my heritage. But seeds are sacred. Culturally significant plants are sacred. And the Great Plains tribes, the Upper Great Lakes tribes, and northeastern New York tribes have this story about the creation of the world as we know it. That Sky Woman fell from the earth, and in her hand she was clutching seeds, and they became the understory and the overstory species in forests, right? And so that out of that, the soil was created in the process, and that created everything that every living thing needs for sustenance on the planet. And this isn't just about who we are today, stories like this, and I urge you to look this up online, this story, it's a powerful story. It's also the opening of Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It speaks not just of who we are, but how we can move forward in this world that's filled with uncertainty. Next slide. So ecocultural forestry, well, it can look quite messy. This is the Cow Creek land of the Umpqua tribe of Indians. They have one of the most amazing progressive forestry programs in the United States. They were also awarded a bunch of the degraded BLM lands, the ONC lands, and they're restoring those lands, doing ecocultural restoration. So what they're doing is thinning and leaving certain trees, so not doing clear cuts, but very intentional thinning. Doing cultural burns, and a cultural burn is very, very low severity. The flames just kind of dance across the surface, and within 24 hours, the grasses are sprouting, for example. And then plant trees, species that were there historically, as well as understory plant species, shrubs, herbs, certain species of grasses that are known to increase soil stability and diversity of flora, fauna within the soil, so microbial diversity. This greatly improves the soil function, this type of light burning, lighting, and planting of those culturally significant species. So it increases the nutrient flow to trees. Cultural burning increases moisture retention properties of the soil because it creates only this very low severity cultural burning, creates something called pyrogenic carbon, and pyrogenic carbon functions, it's charcoal basically, little bits of charcoal that function like sponges, and they can last for up to 5,000 years. They have pores. If you look at a piece of charcoal under a microscope, it's filled with pores, and those pores are like pockets that when it rains can hold that moisture and hold it for the whole season. So all of a sudden you have this soil that's teeming with life. So Native people have known this for millennia. Today we have a name for it. It's called ethnopedology. Pedology is the study of soil, and ethno means it's, related to Indigenous people. And so this is what it looked like a year ago, right after they treated it. I'm going to be looking at those lands, and this is one of our study sites as well. I have a PhD student, who's a young woman in forestry, who is working there with the tribe, and then looking to apply some of those cultural methods to other lands, on federal lands and privately owned woodlands. Next slide. So recommendations are to engage in cultural burning when permissible. The Caddo tribe in Orleans, California had a cultural burning training program for women, only for women. And it was amazing. And so these women came from all over the place, all over the United States, and they were Native women. And they left, with knowing how to do this, knowing how to apply these cultural burns. There's a new fire bill coming through that will allow far more cultural burning. I'm unable to do cultural burning on my woodland. So it's not something that people can just do. It'll allow a lot more flexibility with cultural burning on tribal land, and also for when federal agencies contract tribes to assist them with ecocultural restoration of federal forests. Also, we're looking to see this applied to privately owned forests. And I'm one of the people who's working with the federal government on the policy part of this, like what needs to happen. Next slide. So here's an example of a cultural burn. It is from Cherokee, North Carolina, Dakota. You probably are familiar with this I know you're familiar with the landscape. This is on the reservation. And in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the Cherokee did a cultural burn. And this is, it was, I think, about 10 acres in size. It was a good sized cultural burn. This is what it looked like 1 month later. So you could see, these cultural burns, these species in the understory are totally adapted, and the trees are adapted to these cultural burns. And so what it does is it greatly improves habitat for wildlife, for pollinators, for birds. It creates early seral. That means, the vegetation that just starts sprouting, the young vegetation, and the understory and the overstory. It opens up the canopy a bit to let in more light. And it greatly ramps up the nitrogen cycle in the soil. It's as if you applied fertilizer. And if you didn't know this had been burned a month before that, you would have had no idea, because it was just like teeming with life and growing like crazy. So next slide. So women owning woodlands empowers women landowners to take action toward the future of their land. And I argue that it's not just the future of the land that we own. It's about how humanity can fix this broken relationship with nature. I see a question about the difference between cultural burning and prescribed burns. Prescribed burns are, you make a plan using GIS, you draw a square on a map and say, we're gonna burn this spot. And the lines are like these, it's like, it's a square, usually, very straight lines. A cultural burn is you go out into the field with elders, ethnobotanists, you walk the landscape, and you say, okay, what needs burning here? And you don't use lines on a map. You let the plants and the trees tell you what needs to burn. And you know how you get when you go for a walk in the woods, whether it's your woodland or somebody else's, or, the forest speaks to you. you have all this experience with forests, those of you who are participating today, I know you have amazing experience. And you're able to hear and sense things and see things that tell you what needs to be done. And that's how a cultural burn is planned. It's not somebody in their lab or office saying, okay, we're gonna burn X number of acres. These are the boundaries. And then it's uniform across the whole landscape. With a cultural burn, the burning is not uniform. Certain spots might be skipped because they don't really need to be burned, or maybe they have too much fuel, or maybe they need to be thinned before they're burned. So it's very holistic. So thank you for that question. That was really great. Next slide. Okay, so here's, I have two woodlands. Here's one of them. And this is in the Swan Valley in Montana. My backyard is literally 2.7 million acres of federally protected wilderness. It's the Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Great Bear Wilderness, the Scapegoat Wilderness, Glacier National Park, and Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta. They're contiguous, this wilderness. And then there's a smaller Forest Service wilderness called Visual Basin. Here's the land acknowledgement. So this forest land, this is not my land, it's land that I am charged with taking care of right now. Yes, we did purchase it, but I feel like I'm just a guest on this land. And I'm responsible for it. It lies in the Swan Valley, Montana, within the traditional homelands of the Chinaha people who inhabited this land since time immemorial. This valley was also frequented by the Salish, Quilispec, which are the Pondere and Kalispel Indians, the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfeet. These tribes were forcibly removed to reservations in Montana and Canada. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the Blackfoot Confederacy. So about 20 miles south, this is a very narrow valley with two big mountain ranges, big mountains on either side of it. So the valley it may be 3 to 10 miles wide. It is the wildest place in the lower 48 states. It's wilder than most national parks. There's more grizzly bears here than people. This is where we raised our kids. And we had very peaceful relationships with all those bears and other critters. But 20 miles down the valley, in 1915, there was a massacre of Kootenai who were out hunting and burning. And they were massacred because they were doing cultural burns. They consisted the party of families. So there were women, children, and their husbands, and elders. That just happened in 1915. Since then, these forests have either been managed as commercial forest lands. There's a lot of state lands in there. And then there's a lot of protected areas and all that wilderness, right? So this is the image on the left is what our forests look like. It was that dense, a total closed canopy. A lot of toothpick trees is what I call them. It was just, the more I learned, this is why I went and got a degree in forestry, is I wanted to understand. It didn't feel right to me, but I didn't know enough. So I wanted to understand what I needed to do to be a better steward of that forest. And the image on the right, I worked with a young man and we thinned it. And I taught him how to pick which trees to cut. Some of them had significant commercial value, which trees to leave. It's a transition forest on the shoulder of a mountain. So it's has like 5-needle pines and cedars and also ponderosas. So it's a crazy forest. It's in an ecotone is the ecological term. It's between two ecosystem types, basically. And so that's what it looked like a couple months after we thinned it. Now, I also have a degree in wildlife, and I studied the carnivores and the ungulates a lot. And did a lot of surveys of them for national parks, for example, as an ecologist. So this area is called the Crown of the Continent. It is the most intact ecosystem in the lower 48, and some say it's more intact than Alaska. It contains all the species present at the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition, with the exception of bison and caribou. Anyway, I'd never seen lynx, and I'm an expert wildlife tracker. And in all 30 years of living there, I had never seen any evidence of lynx on our land. Within a month of doing this thinning, all these snowshoe hares showed up. Never seen them either. And a month later, lynx showed up, and I'd be on a Zoom call. This is the view I get from we live in a very funky log cabin there, and my primary residence is now in Corvallis, Oregon, because of the job I have, but we kept this cabin. It was hand built by somebody who just got their degree in the College of Forestry around 1970 and decided they wanted to go out and live in Montana and, live a dream life, harvesting timber and building their own house out of trees they cut from the land. And anyway, I saw lynx, running across this landscape while I'm on a work call. And also wolves and tons and tons of ungulates. All these shrubs came up. The problem I'm facing now is that I'm not allowed to burn this. And so without being able to burn it, I have to keep treating it, with different types of thinnings. And that is a lot of work and costs a lot of money, a lot of effort and money, where being able to apply, a cultural type burn would maintain this a lot more effortlessly. And this is some of the federal legislation that's coming through, because we have to do something. Most of the forests, like in the southeast, in the northeast, wherever I go in North America, the forests resemble that picture on the left. And that's an accident waiting to happen. That's a massive fire waiting to happen. And also, all these birds showed up that I hadn't seen before. So it greatly improved, because the conservation strategy, the image on the right is historically what that forest used to look like. It resembles it. It's sustainable. Those trees are growing a lot more rapidly. Now it's been a couple of years since then, and what I'm seeing is just this forest that's really happy, right? Versus the forest on the left. Well, anyway, next slide. So I'm not allowed to burn it. So you're not allowed to burn private land there. The Forest Service does prescribe burns in a grid, and I think they're generally about 40 acres in size. They're really good size prescribed burns, but they're all done evenly, same severity, burned all the way across like a grid. I'm not allowed to burn. Nobody's allowed to burn on their private woodlands. They're a combination of state laws and federal laws, and it also has to do with air quality, and it's very complicated. And this is something that is currently being changed at the federal level. So that's some of the legislation that's going to be coming through in the next few months. There's a prescribed burning law that allows a lot more flexibility, including for privately owned lands. And we'll see if it makes it through Congress. And if it does, it'll be a major change. So this picture, there's a story here. I don't know how many of you have heard of Dr. Jerry Franklin. He's the person with the walking stick. He's the person who created, in the scientific world, the concept of old growth forest. It wasn't a concept before, until he came along, and he did this in 1980. Until he came along, old forests were considered decadent, and as in not growing fast enough, so we need to cut them. We're wasting resources, and we need to keep cutting forests regularly, because when they get old, they become non-productive. Today in Western science, we know that's not true at all. They're sequestering carbon quite rapidly. Anyway, he's considered the father of old growth, and he was one of my mentors. I'm standing next to him in the purple jacket. And I'm there with the director of the district, that district of the Forest Service, a woman in forestry. And she's the person in the gray, kind of blackish gray, second from the left. She turns to me, we bushwhack over there, and says, Christina, how would you use Indigenous knowledge to restore this forest patch? And she said, oh, so those trees that you see there, most of them are half dead. They're those standing dead trees or on life support. They're like little toothpicks. They're mostly Doug firs. That's an old cedar. And she said, oh, and there's a spotted owl nest in this stand. So technically it's an old growth stand, right? And she turns to me and said, how would you restore this? Using Indigenous knowledge. And here's Jerry Franklin, who created the idea of we should never touch these forests ever for any reason, these old forests just should be left alone. We need some moist forests on top of that, right? So I said, the person on the right, to the right of me, is the director of forests for the BLM for the state of Oregon. And there's a tribal forester there, Colin Beck. He's a person in the tan shirt. And a fire ecologist and the lead silviculturist for the region for the BLM is the person in the green jacket on the left. So it's a spectrum of us. So I said, well, the first thing I would do is just sit in the forest and listen to it. Just sit by myself quietly in the forest. Then I would come back and I would ask tribal elders and people from the community to join me. And I would ask them for advice. Then I would use the very best Western science to thoroughly survey that forest, the understory, the overstory composition, the structure of that forest, and the soil. Then I would collect all the seeds of native plants, because those are the seeds, and I can't tell you what the names of those species are because they're culturally significant, so it's protected information. But they're the culturally significant to tribes and are known to be soil stabilizing species. I would collect their seeds. Then I would harvest the forest and I would have the elders join me and help us choose which trees to cut. And probably taking out about 50% of the trees there. And in a way that would be done with a lot of respect. So it wouldn't affect the spotted owl that's nesting in there. Then I would do a cultural burn, very low severity. And what that cultural burn will do as well is it'll awaken the seed banks in the soil. I've seen that happen over and over again, that after such a burn, there's these species come up that haven't been seen there for 50 years. They're in the soil, they're just buried. And then the following spring, I would plant the seeds that I had collected of the culturally significant plants. And that is where we're trending on national forests right now. That is where what tribes are already doing on their land. And as woodland owners, we can't do all of that, but there are elements of it that we can. And it's also, Indigenous knowledge is totally place-based and based on the idea that the world is changing constantly. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not take out this many trees, apply this type of treatment exactly like this. It's like what I described. You go into the forest and nobody knows your woodlands better than you do, right? And you listen to what that forest is telling you. And you do it with humility, not with, when I go into the forest, I go in there assuming that I know nothing. I am the dumbest creature in that forest, and maybe if I open my senses and pay attention, maybe the forest will tell me what it needs. And I'm sharing with you my Indigenous perspectives. This is very different from the Western way of looking at things, which is we have all these tools, we know what to do, we're going to apply this, and then we'll be good to go. So this is a conversation that's happening at the highest levels in Washington, D.C. Next week, I'm doing they've asked me to do a White House briefing on some of this. So this is being considered as a path forward, because we're running out of time. Those pictures I showed at the beginning demonstrate how we're really running out of time. Next slide. And I'm going to end on hope. So women woodland owners as change makers. The young woman in that image, her name is Monroe Fox. She's was an intern on a project, an ecocultural restoration project that involved fire that I led in Canada when she was 13. Today she's in the field leading a field crew in Oregon, and she's in her second year of college here at Oregon State. She's a forester and an ethnobotanist, and she wants to get a PhD. She is a leader. And what she's doing in that picture is she's measuring the impact of a severe burn, wildfire, in a stand of trees. And when that picture was taken, she had identified 2 species of grasses that hadn't been ever observed in, this is a national park. And the chief botanist for Parks Canada for the whole nation was with us, and he was from that area and had worked there for many years, and he was blown away. So this is a woman in forestry, right? And right now she is, what, 20 years old? So I have a lot of hope. There's a lot of young women like her from all cultures who are very determined. And there's something about women. It has to do with all those traditional stories about women have a special role in nature. We have a certain type of wisdom that's very different from male energy. And I'm not saying that male energy and male wisdom is not good, but our way of approaching a forest is different. And the insights that we get are different. And just like bringing together Indigenous knowledge and Western science, we need all types, all perspectives. We need men and women working together. And to do that, women need to have the barriers that we face as women in forestry removed. Oh, I had great debates with Harvard Forest about that, and in their ongoing debates. And there at Harvard Forest, it's commonly believed that Indigenous people didn't have that much impact on those forest lands. And of course, there's a lot of evidence against, to the contrary. But so how can we be change makers? Well, show up as your most authentic self, practice 7th-generation thinking, be solution focused rather than problem focused. Like, it's easy to feel really overwhelmed, but really think outside the box and think about how you can find a path forward. Be willing to meet people where they are. So for decades, I've lived in very rural communities, and it's quite often assumed that rural landowners don't know anything and are mismanaging their lands. And then when you add the intersectionality of women who are rural landowners, it can get pretty daunting, right? So meet people where they are, but be your most authentic self about it. Bring your best to each moment and be a good ancestor. So, when I asked Monroe, what is your goal in life? She was 13 at the time. I asked that to all the young people who intern on projects with me. She said, to be a good ancestor. Think about that within the 7th generation principle context, what it means to be a good ancestor. Next slide. And with that, we have a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm opening up the chat, and maybe Dakota, you can help me curate some of these questions.
Yeah, definitely. Trying to get unmuted. Okay, awesome. Yes. I think you have been answering them kind of as we've gone, and we've gotten some good questions. So folks, as you have them, type them into the chat box. Right now we have one from Jenny, and she's asking if you would talk more about thinning, all mechanical versus using hack and squirt herbicides to thin trees and manage invasive plants.
Yeah, this is a challenge, and in the Native American world, we don't like to use herbicides, but sometimes we have to. And it's like, when do we do that? Because when you use herbicides, you are also doing harm to certain species that you might not want to be doing harm to. Remember, everything is connected, right? So it's not a simple thing. And so generally speaking, careful mechanical thinning and using herbicides minimally. So a student that I know, a graduate student, she's working with a tribal nation. She's not Indigenous. And she thought about using goats because goats are very selective about what they eat, and they like to eat invasive species often. And so there was an issue with they thinned this forest. It was that picture I showed you of the old savanna restoration. And all of these invasives took over. And so for her master, she brought in goats, and it worked. So, that's what I mean about thinking outside the box and using novel approaches. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any come in yet on my end. We have about 3 minutes left for questions. So if you have one that you'd like to ask it now.
Oh my gosh, that's so powerful about that pine that fell. And that's exactly what I mean. It's like, if we open our senses, we learn things, right? That's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And I really love that women owning woodlands is that sharing stories is a key part of what you do. I encourage you to keep doing that, because that's how we learn from each other, and that's how we've always learned as humans.
We have a good question. Valerie asks, how receptive are lawmakers? And she's curious about your trip to DC next week.
Can you restate that, please?
Yeah, how receptive are lawmakers? She's curious about your trip to DC next week.
Well, the lawmakers are incredibly receptive throughout the United States. And what I'm finding is that this is nonpartisan, because everybody depends on forests and is very concerned about them. And also, people are very risk adverse in our society because, big fires cost a lot of money. I mean, billions of dollars each year, right? And so anything that can be done now is prioritized.
And then another question is, how can we network with local/regional Indigenous peoples to develop relationships and help?
I seem to have lost the visuals on this, and I don't know why.
Oh no. Um, can you hear me? I'll stop sharing my screen. See if that helps with the bandwidth. Oh no, we've lost Christina. Well, we are about 5 minutes away, and I did have some wrap-up questions that I wanted to ask folks. Thank you all for the questions in the chat box. I see some good ones. And I can try and go through and answer some of them in the chat. Oh, looks like we really lost Christina. Oh no. Bummer. But I had some reflection questions that I wanted to ask everyone. I have three, and you can choose one. And you can write your response in the chat box or write it down on a piece of paper next to you just for you to have. I really just wanted to think and ponder a couple of the things that we talked about today. So I'm pasting them into the chat. And the questions are, what does resilience mean to you? What do you value about your land that you steward or care about? And was there anything that you heard tonight that will shape how you approach the rest of the conference? So feel free to just choose one of these and type your answer into the chat box, or just write it down on a piece of paper next to you if you have that. Or if I see some folks that are out in the woods, just kind of think about your answer to one of these questions. And as we take a minute or two to do this, I'm going to go through some of these questions and maybe try and answer a couple of them. Awesome. And we have some folks typing in. Vera says, a lot more actively looking to create a forestry plan, but will aim to look for Indigenous knowledge as a part of it and research how to find that in New York City watershed. Someone else says, I definitely need a lot of practice in this, but trying to be more intentional about listening to land. I love the story of her with other scientists in the woods and how she'd approach its management. Yes, I love that story too, particularly with the grouping of people that she was with and Jerry Franklin. If folks are unfamiliar with the story of old growth and kind of how it came to like Western science, I highly recommend listening to the Oregon Public Broadcasting has a podcast on the timber wars. It's about 7 episodes. It's really well done, and it's really interesting and really good. So I highly recommend that. Oh, Valerie says, answering the third question, to be patient. In just the 6 years I've been managing family forests, regional foresters have more embraced notions of burning and biochar. Yes, yeah, the patience is key. Because growing forests is very different than like growing tomatoes or growing something out in your garden that just takes 1 year to grow and produce fruit. Growing trees and landscapes takes a lot of time, and a lot of patience, and a lot of practice. Sarah, the recommendation, are you asking about the recommendation of the old growth podcast I was talking about? Okay, yes, yeah. So the podcast is from Oregon Public Broadcasting, and it's about the timber wars. And I think if you just search that, it will come up. I'm not sure of the title. Oh, Lara, thank you. Awesome. Great. Anne says that she values the great variety of life my land supports. Yes. Yeah. And someone else says being more intentional about listening to the land. A lot of that. Awesome. Well, I just have a couple announcements before we wrap up for the day. For folks that are joining us tomorrow, we have a new Zoom link. So that was sent in the conference packet. So make sure that you have that one. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email into the chat. And I'll touch base with Christina again and get her slides and kind of the resources and links that she's shared, and I'll email them out to everybody. We also recorded tonight's presentation, and I'll send that out to folks too who were joined late or who weren't able to join us. I will say that the breakout rooms and kind of the presentations for the next 2 days, we unfortunately are not going to be able to record them. We just don't have that capacity with the number of breakouts that are happening. So yes, Lara, the Zoom link for tomorrow looks like the same one. I think it is the same one, but last time we did this, there was a lot of confusion about the Saturday one is different. So I'm just saying, click on the new link every day. Yeah. Alrighty, and with that, we're wrapping up for today. Thank you so much, everybody.